Welcome everyone to Wine Wednesday. Tonight's wine is 14 Hands, hot to trot. And Mark asked the other day about what the red blends are. And so, I took that 10 seconds to get on Google and feel really cool to be able to say that a red blend is a blend of like the Merlot and the Cabernet, all of the good red cool wines. It's blend. It's red blends are awesome. I really like them. And depending on the winery or what brand, it can taste completely different based on how much of each they put in. It's really a cool thing. So, you know, red blends. I like them. Very, very good. Okay. On to the show. Chris Carey of Seahorse World is joining us today. And first of all, tell me a little bit about your background and what you were doing before you got started with Seahorse World.
Professionally speaking, I sort of had nothing to do with the industry itself. I've actually spent the last decade or so working in retail or hospitality. So yeah, I just got into fish keeping, and then I started breeding things, and then the fish keeping bug really bit me, and I just got into keeping and breeding all different sorts of stuff from fish, catfish, cichlids, freshwater shrimp, freshwater crayfish, everything.
When we talked earlier, you said you were like about to do discus, right? Isn't that right?
Yeah, I was setting up to do discus, and then I ended up getting this job. So then I had to pack up everything and move basically. So I moved state and came down here to live the dream down in Tassie.
Awesome. And just to let you know, I've kept discus. Freshwater fish people do not kill me because I love the discus. The seahorses and the other things that Chris gets to work with at his job are so awesome, and you're gonna see them in a minute. Promise. What made you decide to go apply at Seahorse World?
So that's a really good question, and that'll sort of bring you into how I got here and how I got started. So basically, I got the fish keeping bug, and I started setting up more and more tanks. I kept sort of moving house and pretty much setting up a dedicated fish room at each house we moved into. And as we sort of kept moving from house to house to house, accumulating more and more tanks, it kind of reached the peak when we got up to 64 tanks at home.
Oh my gosh.
And I was pretty much working full time. I was actually working at KFC at the time. And so I was working, cooking chicken, and then coming home and just looking after fish. So it was like a full-time job on top of a full-time job. I've kind of figured that I was looking after that many different tanks, that on my days off, I wouldn't mind looking after other people's tanks. And so I set up a small business looking after other people's aquariums. It was Warrnambool Aquarium Maintenance Services.
Awesome.
So basically I would go and sort of clean other people's tanks on my days off, or help customers move their aquariums, because not many people are actually set up to move large aquariums. Whereas I'd had a great deal of experience in moving tanks. So basically I had a really bad day at work one day and said, I really need to do something else, something that I'm actually passionate about. And basically I hit the internet really hard, started searching online for, another job. I basically knew that I wanted to do something within the industry. I wanted to, work at an aquarium store, or working at a public aquarium, or, something with breeding or keeping fish. I did eventually come across an ad for Seahorse World for the aquarium manager position, and I sort of looked at it and I went, it's in Tasmania. And then I'm like, what's the harm? I'll have a look anyways and see what it, entails. And I clicked on the job description and I started reading through all the amazing work that they were doing down at Seahorse World. And I thought, breeding seahorses on a large scale on a seahorse farm, running, a public aquarium, running tours through the aquarium and teaching other people and educating people about different species of seahorse and different species of fish. I went, wow, this sounds really, really awesome. This sounds amazing. And then I'm like, it's down in Tasmania. And I thought, I don't really have, any degrees or any sort of personal or professional sort of paperwork, academically to sort of back me up. So I thought, I'm not even really going to get a look in. So I'll just apply anyways. What's the harm? Nothing to lose. My boss, Craig, actually almost skimmed through my resume. Like, he just read what I was doing professionally at the start of my resume, and then he sort of skimmed to the bottom, not even reading most of it. And at the very bottom, basically, I sort of focused on what I was doing in my personal life and all the different species of fish that I was keeping and breeding and all that different stuff. And, he started taking a double take at it, and he went back through and read it properly after that. And he's like, wow, this guy is really, really obsessed with fish. He's all about, keeping and breeding all these different types of fish. And he's like, this is really the kind of person that I want, running the aquarium and breeding all of our seahorses. And, I want someone that's passionate about fish. And so that's actually how it all started. Long story short, I packed up everything and moved down to Tasmania. And here I am.
That is like the most amazing story to me, because it gives someone like me hope, because I would love to someday get a position doing something within the industry, and I just don't have that biology degree. I don't have that stuff. To hear that, you were able to go in and get this job just based on your passion and your love for breeding and taking care of animals is such a good point. So how long have you worked at Seahorse World now? Since you started?
So I've been at Seahorse World for around 18 months, so about a year and a half.
What would you say are the biggest challenges that you face in your day-to-day working at Seahorse World? What's the hardest thing about your job?
Probably like just trying to juggle everything. There's 1,000,001 projects going on at any given time. And so it's very hard to sort of juggle with success, actually, doing everything all at once. It's like, juggling a whole bunch of balls, and, all it takes is taking your eye off the ball for 1 second to drop one of those balls and, potentially, lose something really important.
Okay, so what exactly do you do is, I guess, the first question I should have asked. What is your position at Seahorse World?
So I'm the aquarium manager, and basically my role there is to basically run the farm, so run the day-to-day operations at Seahorse World. And my side of the role is more sort of aquarium driven rather than, say, customer service based. So we have a whole bunch of tour guides which run people through tours, take people through and teach them all about the aquarium and all about all the farm and the different species that we're looking after and everything, and how the seahorse breeding on a large scale works. But my role is to keep all of the tanks looking great, to collect babies every day and look after all the different systems. First thing I do every single morning, aside from check on all the livestock, is to actually siphon the tanks, clean up all the poo, all the yucky stuff.
Do you have people that work like under your?
Definitely. So I'm sort of the head of the aquarium team, and so I have 3 people that I work alongside pretty much on a day-to-day basis. They're all tour guides as well as aquarium staff, so they generally do their thing in the aquarium in the morning and help out, and then they duck in and start running tours for the day. But without those people, everything would basically fall back on me, and it would be a massive workload, and it'd probably be too much, to be honest. So right. Massive shout out to Jesse, James and Quan.
Thank you.
I wouldn't be able to do it without those guys every day.
That's awesome. And yes, thank you for mentioning them. What species of seahorses have you been successful with in breeding at Seahorse World?
The potbelly seahorse, or Hippocampus abdominalis, is the main species that we focus on historically. And so, we're breeding those around the clock. They're the main species that we farm, but we do also farm a couple of different other species. So my main focus since I've started has been Hippocampus reedi, or the slender seahorse, or short snout seahorse, whatever you want to call them. Mm-hmm. And so that's actually been one of my biggest focuses since starting, because when I started, they were actually in a really, really bad position here in Australia. We do actually have the only remaining slender seahorses, or reedi, left in Australia. And so I'm really trying to focus on changing that, trying to breed up enough to actually sell to the Australian market and the international market. The reason why I'm trying to change that is because of Australia's CITES laws. We can't bring more in if we lose what we have, if that makes sense. So once they're gone forever here in Australia. Of course, you guys can still breed them overseas in America or in the UK, or anywhere else around the world. But if we lose what we have, then they're gone forever. So, as someone that's been involved in the hobby for a long time, unfortunately in Australia, we've already lost a lot of different fish species over the years because of people not committing to breeding things long term, or accidents or incidents where there's been power outages and they've lost their good breeders or whatever. And so I don't want to see that happen to the slender seahorse or the reed-eyes. The other species that we're breeding are Hippocampus whitei, so white seahorse. We are doing some other work with a few different other species, but we're not really breeding them in good numbers yet. So we're also working on Hippocampus angustus, or the western spiny seahorse. And we're also hoping to breed subilongatus, Hippocampus subilongatus, or WA seahorse.
Something goes wrong, they pass and they're gone. Then you're saying that Australia won't let you
bring more in
countries. Okay, and that's for public aquariums too?
Yeah, that's just across the board. They won't let any more into the country. So once they're gone, they're gone. The reason why we actually have them is because they were brought into the country before these laws came in. And so I think we've had these ones going since about 2003, just before the laws came in. And so, we were really lucky that we got them in before these laws came in. Otherwise, we wouldn't even have them. Historically, you guys talk about a lot of different species here on this channel and on the seahorse groups. And I'm sort of really envious because, your erectus and other species, I hear about them and I get to see all these awesome pictures of them, and I'm a little bit envious that we can't keep them. So we can't bring them in and we can't keep them. And so, I'm a little bit jealous.
That's crazy because, that's just, not crazy was a bad word. That's awesome. That awesome's a bad word too. That's interesting. It's very interesting because, erectus are very readily available here. I can't even imagine. And whereas some of the other species you've mentioned, I'm like, oh, if I could just see one, I'd be thrilled. What are the rules about exporting? Because I know here a lot of public aquariums, will basically, in a sense, trade seahorses. Like, say, you have some of these, I have some of these, or I need some of these. But you're saying Australia can't do that. They can't import, but can they export? Or is it just through you, or how's that work?
So Seahorse World is actually really lucky in that we're one of the few CITES accredited aquaculture or farms, I guess you'd say. And so we're actually able to trade in species that technically most people aren't able to under the CITES regulations. And I've heard that we're one of the only CITES, accredited sort of businesses like that. And so it does sort of give us kind of a special exemption that we're able to, export some of these species like barbarii and cuda and, species like that. So we can actually, sell them, but we can't actually sort of bring them in, which is a little bit funny.
Yeah, that is kind of funny. That I kind of understand. That's really promoting that people take care of what they have, and heck, as much as I might have different feelings about the laws and the rules, Australia is doing an amazing job of, much better than other places of restoring and keeping things going. So, do you only deal with wholesale or public aquariums, or can you sell to people?
We do obviously sell wholesale. We sell to all of Australia's big wholesalers, and we sell to wholesalers overseas as well. So, we do recommend that people use our wholesalers, and meaning that you can go into your local fish store and get seahorses special ordered in from the wholesalers. But if you want to go above and beyond, you can actually buy direct from us. The only downside to that will be the freight costs and things won't be sort of absorbed by the wholesalers or by the fish stores. They'll, you'll be hit directly with the cost of freighting them to you.
That's really interesting, though. So if I'm understanding correctly, hobbyists in general, should go to their local fish stores, ask, their fish stores to possibly, get whatever species from you if they can't get them somewhere else, and that can work out. And it might cost a little more than average because of export and import and all that. But if someone who who was like, wanted a specific species and was willing to fork over the money for it, they could have it shipped to them. That's
Yeah,
interesting.
definitely.
That's interesting for me. As a professional breeder at Seahorse World, things are very different from what a hobbyist experiences in breeding. However, is there any key piece of advice that you feel leads to success that you would give to hobbyists?
So the biggest key thing I would say is give it 100%. So obviously do a lot of your research in that before you get into it, rather than just diving in the deep end. But make sure you're constantly feeding good foods. Make sure you look after your water quality. So keep the water quality nice and high. Nice clean water, really good foods. Something that I'd probably recommend personally, from my experience both with seahorses and other fish raising them, is feed small amounts but feed frequently. So make sure that the fish, as they're growing up, have plenty of food available to them, but make sure that you're not overfeeding, because as soon as you start to feed too much, your water quality is going to go straight down. And so, it's a constant sort of battle to, give them enough food to keep them happy and growing, but without, compromising the water quality to go with it.
Great point. That is an excellent point, and I don't think it's mentioned very often, so I'm glad you made it. Very good point. Is there any species in particular, I do want to know about seahorses, but you can say fish too. Is there any species in particular that you feel are easier to breed?
I would say the potbelly seahorse, Hippocampus abdominalis, is definitely the easiest for us to breed. We're breeding them in such high numbers, and, we're doing them on a large scale. So they're what I think is easy, but I hear overseas that, other people struggle with them. But I guess we have the right, water temperatures and everything for them down here. So I guess they would be easier for us down here compared to, say, someone in a tropical climate, seeing as these guys are subtropical or, temperate, I guess you'd say.
What temperature do you keep the water, or what temperature is the water approximately?
So we do regulate it. We do regulate it a little bit so that it doesn't reach the extremes of, say, in the middle of winter or in the middle of summer. We kind of try and balance it a bit more in the middle there, but we generally try and keep the water 16 to 19 degrees. We generally find with the potbelly seahorses that issues start to crop up and things start to go south a lot quicker if the water is, say, 20 degrees or above. Mm-hmm. And I'd say that basically don't keep them above 21 degrees or you're just asking for trouble.
So if someone did want to keep them and they weren't in Australia or, whatever, they should definitely look into a chiller, which is different from other species, but they need to keep the water cooler than other species. Makes sense. Walk me through the Seahorse World tour.
Yeah, definitely. So what we do is a 45-minute guided tour. We start you off in a room called the cave. And now in the cave, we've got 6 different tanks set up with 5 different species of seahorses. And so you'll get to see a nice little subsection of seahorses that you'll find around the world and around Australia. And that's sort of our introduction to Seahorse World. And you get to see, how the species sort of differ from one another. That's a general sort of introduction to seahorses in the cave. And then we will also talk about one of our other tanks, which actually has hybrids in it, and sort of an introduction to hybrids and how they can and do happen in the hobby. Then we move on to the farm. And so the farm concentrates solely on the potbelly seahorse, which aren't in the first room. So it's a whole different species from what you see in the first room. But this is where we scale things right up, and this is where, the farm is, and where, you see all of the seahorses being farmed on a much larger scale. You see the breeders initially, and then we move on to, we talk to you about the reproductive process with the seahorses and, how they breed. And then we move on to the nursery, where you get to see all of the different babies, and you get to see them develop from, fry that have just been born that morning or just the previous day, all the way through to, fry that are sort of around about 2 months old before they sort of get moved on.
So people can literally see a seahorse at every single stage of life. That's so cool.
You get to walk around our pot system and you get to see basically, seahorses, say, several days apart. And so you get to walk around and pretty much get to watch them grow up. So after that, you get to see our rathbun systems, which are basically our giant grow-out tanks. Tens of thousands of seahorses at any given time. We have the Southern Ocean Aquarium after the farm.
Okay.
Also, while we're in the farm, you do also get to see the different foods that we feed the seahorses at the different age groups, I guess you'd say. So we go into the process of the artemia and how we process and hatch it every day. And we also talk about our mysid shrimp that we feed our seahorses when they grow up. Yeah, then we go on to the Southern Ocean Aquarium, and you'll get to see a whole bunch of special fish, which many of them are found in Tasmania. Some of them are exclusively found in Tasmania. You will not find them anywhere else in the world, which is quite special. We're a small private business, and so we haven't got the massive budgets and that come with, really big companies, big aquariums all around the world. We're not, state or government funded. So instead of trying to, match the guys with the big budgets, we just try and do our own thing. The spotted handfish, which you won't find anywhere else in the world. And we just focus on, things that you won't see anywhere else.
The uniqueness is what is so cool. I'm going to have to come to Australia because that is what people want to see and need to see, is exactly what you just described. I mean, what size foods, what you do to the foods. Oh my gosh. That's like, I'm coming to Australia is all. Quick question about the separation of the potbellies. Is that for temperature reasons or just because they're your specialty?
A little bit of both. So the reason why we're doing the potbellies on a much bigger scale and sort of isolated and separate from everything else is all of the species that we show you are either subtropical or tropical. And then we move on to the potbellies, and that's all temperature controlled. So, obviously we keep it nice and cool in there at any given time, and it's a much different climate in there to, the rooms where we keep all of the, tropical species. That's one of the main reasons, but the other reason is just to sort of focus on the sort of aquaculture, the farming aspect of it. Not something that your average person will ever sort of see, and so it's quite interesting how you get to see them being farmed on such a large scale.
When I'm picturing this, and we're getting ready to watch the little clip, but when I'm picturing this, I'm picturing my house, and I breed on an extremely small scale. And when someone asked me 2 weeks ago if I would do a walkthrough and show my seahorse tanks and my production, I said maybe in a month. I got to clean that up. I mean, doesn't it suck to be on display, was the point.
One of the challenges about working in a public aquarium is having your work constantly on display and constantly under the microscope. And so, we have potentially hundreds of people walking through on any given day. And so basically you will find me walking through the aquariums. You will find me, working on aquariums. You might even be lucky enough to come through on a tour where you see me in an aquarium, kind of actually physically inside of it, scrubbing away or, cleaning it or whatever. And so I guess that's one of the things. It is a working farm, and so you'll actually get to see, stuff that normal public aquariums probably wouldn't want you seeing. I personally think seeing me scrubbing away inside of a tank's probably not all that interesting, and so I try and minimize the effects of what I'm doing in the aquarium at any given stage. So, I try to minimize where people might actually see me cleaning aquariums, but definitely you'll see me kind of either walking through the aquarium or working on aquariums, maybe feeding out on tours. We try and do that so you actually get to see a lot of the creatures being fed on your tours. And so, it's one of those things that I have to constantly juggle, being under the microscope like that and having people seeing what I'm doing. But at the same time, I like to actually stop and talk to our guests where I can about our creatures. And so, if you have any questions, of course, our tour guides are quite knowledgeable and they're able to tell you anything that you want to know. So you get to ask all sorts of questions on the tours, but you can also hopefully have a chance to chat with someone like me and I'm happy to answer any questions or talk about, anything aquarium related while I'm in there.
And even go so far as to come on my channel and answer questions. You're awesome.
Yeah, definitely.
For the record, I disagree with what you said about maybe it's not that interesting to see you cleaning a tank. I think those things are extremely interesting. No, seriously, because those are the questions you see in these groups. Or maybe they're not the questions, but they're the questions that people should be asking, because they don't understand.
Yeah, definitely.
They got to clean the walls, I'm going to give you a little clip of Seahorse World. And we'll be right back. I'll ask a couple more questions, and then Chris will answer your questions. Let's take a look at Seahorse World.
We've got a bit of a feeding frenzy going at the moment. All of our squid are feeding. We're feeding them pilchards and they're loving it. So, trying to pick up the squid that hasn't had any food yet, which is this little fella. And we're going to offer him some. And see how he likes it. And there we go. Look at all those beautiful colours. I think he's a little bit happy with his food. Aren't you, buddy? Yeah? And you see him holding on to it. And all these other squid have actually got food. You can kind of see it through their tentacles. That fella over the back there is holding a big chunk out. This little fella's contently holding it. Nice and happy eating. Happy buddy. Just trying to eat it sideways, as you do. Look at all the chromatophores in their skin. They can change colours on the fly. Show all these beautiful colours through. Nice purples and greens and blues. Sometimes I think it'd be nice if people showed their colours on the outside just like these guys. Show how you feel. Check out these guys, they're so happy.
You can always see these videos at Seahorse World on YouTube. Link will be in the description. Please check them out. They're very cool and really good videos. I was really impressed. So, you guys just celebrated 20 years. Congratulations. That's awesome. And can you tell me why the company started in the first place?
Yeah, definitely. So the reason why we started in the first place was to supply the traditional Chinese medicine market. Now, each year in China and perhaps other Asian countries, seahorses are taken by the millions, and they are basically taken, collected, killed, dried out, and crushed into a powder, and they are used in traditional Chinese medicine. Now, we started up with the aims of sort of supplying that market. So we would, farm the seahorses with, conservation and that in mind. So it's able to be done again and again and again. And, they're not just taking them from the wild again and again and again, because very unsustainable. And so we're trying to, sort of limit how much they're doing that and trying to obviously make a business out of it as well. I mean, they're doing it anyways, so why not supply them with, a sustainably grown seahorse product? Historically, that kind of failed very quickly. We actually we ramped up production, we grew up a heap of seahorses, and we tried to provide for that market. Now, the problem that we come up against was the Chinese are only willing to pay a certain amount for those dried seahorses, and they buy their seahorses by weight. Now, if you can imagine a seahorse dried out and you extract all of the water, seahorses are made up of 90-something% water or 80-something% water. If you dry them out, they weigh very, very little. They're like, comparing a potato chip to a potato. They weigh next to nothing. The price that they were willing to give us was not, economically viable. Mm-hmm. And so basically that failed. It's like they were willing to give us, say, 50 cents each for the seahorses, which it's just not, viable to do by the time you employ people and raise them and whatnot. It just was not working. So someone came up with the very bright idea of raising them for the aquarium market. It makes a lot more sense to, breed them, raise them, and sell them to people to have in their aquariums.
For the record, before I hear anyone else's opinion or even look at a comment, I want to say that I applaud you for trying, because no matter how we feel about certain things, I love my seahorses and it bothers me to even hear you talk about that. But the thing is, you're trying to save seahorses, conservation through cultivation. You're trying to save the seahorses in the wild. And I think it's amazing, and I wish it had worked. And I'm going to go research like crazy and write like crazy about how there could ever be a fix for this, because I do see that as the main problem. There are costs involved with raising and breeding. I completely understood what you said, and I applaud you guys. How did you go from providing or trying to provide seahorses for traditional Chinese medicine? How did you take it from there to providing to the hobbyists and to wholesalers and doing a tour and being a public aquarium? Was that a hard process or pretty easy? Or
so the tourism aspect of the business actually came about quite naturally. Occasionally they would get a knock on the door for the shed, and they would actually get people, saying, "Oh, can we have a look inside? Can we see a working seahorse farm?" And so they said, "Yeah, sure, come on through." And so this happened once or twice, and then it actually became quite a regular thing. After a while, it got to the point where, it was just constantly interrupting their sort of their work during the day. They would be working for, say, 5-10 minutes, and then they'd have someone knocking on the door, and they would sort of bring them through, and then halfway through bringing them through, they'd have someone else knocking on the door, and so it became a bit of a mess. And so one day, where the owner actually advertised it on the local radio as an event, come down and see seahorse is being bred, basically, and see the farm. And the turnout for that was massive. I know all you guys don't know how big the wharf is, but we had people lined up down and around the wharf and off the end of the wharf back onto the land. And so, the turnout was absolutely huge, more than they could deal with. And so they went, there's definitely an industry here. So that's how Seahorse World was actually set up. So Seahorse World actually primarily sort of, their main focus is the tourism aspect of the business. And so Seahorse Australia and Seahorse World are two separate kind of entities. They're both owned by the same people now. And so we're basically almost the same business, but we just have sort of different focuses. So Seahorse World focuses on that tourism aspect. So we set up in a different shed on the same wharf, and that's where we breed the potbelly seahorses, as well as the red-eye and whitey-eye. But Seahorse Australia now focuses on the barbs or barber-eye and the cooter.
Do you feel that even though your vision and reason changed, do you feel that you're still impacting conservation in general? I know you mentioned that you guys work with scientists, schools, do studies. I just wanted to give you a moment to speak about the fact that that you're still working with things to promote conservation. So go ahead and tell us about that.
Yeah, definitely. So what we're doing is basically we're a fully commercial business, right? We're purely kind of in it to, I guess, sort of make money. But the reason why we're doing what we're doing, aside from making money, is to, kind of support conservation and sustainability within the market. So what we're doing is we're providing seahorses for you guys, for people's tanks, and for the aquarium trade and for public aquariums. And we're basically providing you guys with captive bred seahorses rather than taking them from the wild. Comparing captive bred seahorses to wild caught seahorses is like comparing apples and oranges. They're readily trained onto prepared foods, and so you can readily look after them, and you don't have to go out and try and catch shrimp to feed them, and you don't have to raise copepod cultures or things like that. They're much easier to look after. They're much easier to feed. I think that's a big part of it, the sustainability aspect of it. The other part of your question, we've done a whole bunch of different studies for different things. So we've done research on how seahorses' eyes work, and that's been used for scientists studying that because they actually work very similar to our eyes and how they sort of focus, although they're able to move independently a lot better than ours. We can go cross-eyed, and some people have the ability to make their eyes go everywhere, but seahorses are able to focus much better than ours, and so they've done studies on that. Currently, we're doing a joint program with the CSRIO to work on the conservation of spotted handfish. Spotted handfish are only found down here in Tasmania, and they're only found in a very, very small area of the Derwent estuary down in Hobart. They're critically endangered. There's only about 1,000 of them left in the wild. And so we're working with the CSRIO to bring these guys back from the brink of extinction. And we've actually had some success so far. So we've managed to breed them in captivity. We've managed to raise a whole heap of the fry. We're still sort of growing them out until they get to a stage where we'll be able to send them off to other places to continue breeding them in the future. But we'll also release some back into the wild and try and give them a fighting chance because of humans' impact with habitat destruction due to introduced species, exotic species from elsewhere. These things are on the verge of extinction, and so we're trying to help against that.
Awesome and amazing. And I'm going to have you come back on like 2 or 3 more times because all of these topics need more time, and everybody's like dinging me like crazy. Let me in. My absolute final question, the most important question of the night, because this is Wine Wednesday, is that there is some local taverns and wineries close to you, correct? I saw literally on the attraction list, there are like 2 wineries right near. Is that correct?
The Tamar Valley region is well known for its wine. It's actually quite famous for its wines. And so we have a heap of different wineries around here. We probably have more than a dozen. I don't actually really drink wine, so I'm probably not the person to talk to about it. But yeah, definitely. So if you come down to this area, there's plenty of wineries to visit and there's plenty of great wines.
I'm going to open this up. Everybody feel free to talk. I'm going to check messages and take a little 10-second break. So please don't let the conversation lull, and I'll be right back.
I'm just going to ask a question like KG Tropic had to Chris. Do you guys breed anything besides seahorses right now, like pipefish or cephalopods, anything like that?
Historically, we've bred a whole heap of different. Now, it's not our main focus, but we've had instances in the past where, like last year, I had a whole heap of pack. This is the sort of hobbyist side of me coming out, but I'm like, this is so awesome. I want to kind of try and raise these and see if we can't get, some babies out of it. And so I was sort of looking after the eggs on a daily basis, kind of kept on kind of trying to check them out and see how they were developing on the inside. And the mother octopus was there looking after them. And I think it was probably like 2 months later, the eggs came full circle and developed, and they started hatching. And so, you know, I was so excited. I was like, and the little baby octopuses hatched out, and they were so cute. And, you know, so I actually took a video of it on, I think it was the 2nd or 3rd day that we had some hatching. And, you know, I had these little baby octopus that I'd collected out, and I had them in a bucket, and I was like talking about how the baby octopus had just been born and whatnot. And I actually, you know, took a video of that, and I posted it on our social media, on our Facebook page for Seahorse World. And that post ended up going quite viral. And, you know, we had local radio stations. We had even a TV crew wanting to do some footage for a documentary. And so, you know, little things like that are kind of little side projects for me, but they're quite interesting things that I think a lot of people sort of resonate with, and they find it really interesting. And, you know, people just love baby animals. So if you get a baby, you know, pipefish, baby octopus, baby squid, baby, you know, anything, people just love it.
I know Dan is just aching to ask a question.
How you doing, Chris?
Good, thanks, Dan. How about yourself?
Good. Congratulations on your position. It's an envious position for many. A couple questions I had was about your fry systems. You've probably seen from my stuff, I use a lot of round tanks, and I'm assuming that you guys do the same. And I'm wondering if you guys do deploy the Kreisel method at all for pelagic fry.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. Thanks for asking. Also great to chat with you as well. We do have a lot of round pot systems. They're the ones that we primarily use for our pot bellies. We do have some other species like reed-eye and angustus that have pelagic fry. And, you know, historically, they're the hardest for us to raise because of the issues that you have with them. I've actually had some mixed success raising them, but I haven't been raising them in Kreisel systems. I've been raising them just in square tanks, but I haven't had as much success as I would like. So it is something that I want to have a play with and sort of explore more and see if I have more success in a Kreisel system.
Sure. Are you guys using pods with them to start off with?
No, so that's a really good question also. I really, really want to get into using pods, but historically we've had some issues with them. We've had some parasitic copepod species that have, you know, basically attacked and caused a lot of mortalities in our seahorse fry. And so right now we currently don't use any at all. We just use, you know, Artemia and rotifers. Yeah, I would like to get back into using copepods, and it's one of those million projects that I've got on the go. I'm hoping to
Sure.
set up and
do you guys,
get into that.
Do you guys try to collect plankton at all?
No, we don't.
I found my best success with using plankton. Using rotifers, you know, for example, the Teneropterus or the Cuda that you guys have, our best success with those was about 50% using rotifers and going to Artemia. But when we went to plankton, all of a sudden it just shot up to crazy, stupid numbers with success. We ran out of space because we had too much success, if you will.
That's a great problem to have.
Well, it is, but it kind of screws up your breeding program because you're on hold until you get rid of everything. The white-eye that you guys have, and I think Project Seahorse classifies the Proceras as the same thing. Do you guys do the Proceras as well?
No, we don't.
Do you know if you guys have any plans or availability at doing the Breviceps?
So we do actually have Breviceps. We haven't been breeding them since I've been here, but it is one of those projects that I really want to get going again. The reason why we don't breed them at the moment is because I've only got two and they're both females. but I am trying to hunt down some breviceps down here and, get a breeding program going, because I think, dwarf seahorses definitely have their place in the hobby. And so I'd really love to get the breviceps going again and have them available for the aquarium trade, both in public aquariums and for hobbyists.
The breviceps are a big request up this way. Everybody asks for them. I do the abdominalis as well here, and in fact, I try as hard as I can to keep the brakes on them, but they still populate faster than I can sell them. And I find them to be the easiest species of all the species to breed. And it's too bad you cannot get the erectus down there, because you guys would have great success with those, and they would be a very desirable species down there.
Yeah, definitely.
Looking at pictures, it looks like you guys are right on the water.
Yeah, so we're literally on a wharf, and so it's probably like 50 meters off the shore, and so we're right there on the water.
Are you guys able to use natural seawater that way?
Yeah, so we actually pump our seawater in, and so like in one of Kelly's questions earlier, I did actually talk about good water quality being one of the fundamental things that you need. And so we actually pump our water in. It goes through a sand filter, goes through a special machine known as Memtech, and I probably attribute that our supply of clean, purified seawater as being one of the biggest reasons for our success. So it goes through all these different stages of filtration and goes through UV and everything like that. But basically what it means is that as our plant and equipment sort of stage level things go, we have basically clean, purified salt water on tap. So I can get, big hoses and whatnot and just do massive water changes, where everyone at sort of a hobbyist kind of level almost dreads doing water changes. Whereas for me, water changes are the solution to, almost every problem. If there's too much waste, whatever, just do a big water change and that fixes that.
Well,
and so we do daily water changes.
What about alkaline water, or wastewater, I should say?
It goes through UV filter before it goes back down into the tamer.
A little envious. I have to haul the water in.
I was going to say, I'm sorry, Dan, but I was going to say I'm extremely envious too. I can't imagine you've got a complete setup and the filtration. That is amazing. Sorry, Dan, go ahead.
No, I'm envious because I have to, in order to use seawater, I have to go collect it. I have to go out at high tide and get as close as I can to the sea and pump it, filter it, sterilize it, go through the whole mess. And, I end up doing that several times a week. And I'd be real envious of not having to make those trips so many times. That's really all the questions that I had. I did notice it on the potbellies that at the temperatures that you recommend, we keep them at 19. And we notice ourselves that when you get above, I go by Fahrenheit, but I'm guessing it's going to be around 21 or so, there's problems. And one of the issues that I often see is I have people ask me all the time, well, why can't you breed them to live in higher temperatures? And they don't seem to understand that you can't do evolution in a matter of a few breeding cycles. And people think they can keep them at around, I guess, what would be close to 21, 22 Celsius. And from what I've seen, they don't last long. Yeah,
definitely. So that's a really good point. You can't undo sort of millions of years of sort of evolution in, the blink of an eye to sort of raise them in warmer temperatures. I guess after many, many years of breeding, say a couple of decades, maybe you might get to that point. But I don't even think it's them being tolerant of the temperatures. I think it's more just, things as the temperature starts to move up start to happen a lot quicker. The sort of metabolic rate of, parasites or bacteria starts to grow exponentially once you start getting, even just a few degrees up. And so I think, things start going south a lot quicker once those temperatures start to come up.
Gotcha.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you for being on tonight, and I've enjoyed it, and I've appreciated it, and I'll let other people jump in here and ask their questions.
Thank you, Dan, for
Not a problem.
coming.
Thanks for having the chat, Dan.
What do you like the most about working at Seahorse World? What's your favorite thing?
That's a really good question. I work in a very beautiful place. So Seahorse World is situated in Beauty Point in Tasmania, which is on the Tamar River. And every single morning I come to work, whether it's a grey, miserable, rainy day or whether it's a clear sky or whatever, I usually come at the crack of dawn. And most mornings I actually get to see the sun come up, which is beautiful. But, I come to work in a beautiful place. I'm working with beautiful, majestic creatures. And, every day is a new challenge. Every day is, a new kind of experience. And like Dan has said in previous live streams, you're constantly learning every single day. It's just an awesome experience every single day. And, I've sort of been thrown in the deep end, I feel, a little bit. I didn't know very much at all about seahorses when I very first started. And so, especially with things like the reed-eye in the situation that they were when I started, I had to basically get thrown in the deep end and figure out how to bring them back before we lost them. And they're doing much, much better now. We're actually raising a decent number now, which is really reassuring that we're not going to lose the species. But just having, challenges to work towards like that and actively feeling like I'm making a difference in the hobby and making a small little difference in the world doing what I'm doing, whereas none of my previous jobs I really felt like I was, actually making a difference. I could say, I made the company a little bit of money this year, I had profits of 10% up, 15% up, 20% up, whatever. But that doesn't make you as an employee feel very good about, what you're doing on a day-to-day basis. Whereas if you're overcoming challenges and you can actually see the real difference that you make, if you can see that a seahorse species which hasn't been available on the market for a few years is now available, and that's the difference that you've made, that actually is a really awesome feeling, to feel like you're actually making a difference, and not many jobs can provide that sort of experience.
Having that passion in your position, in your job, that you're making that difference is just, yeah, I wish I had it. So I'm really jealous, but I'm so glad, those reed-eye are doing better, because you might have been thrown into it, but you figured it out and you kept trying until you got it right. And now you're getting it right, and that's so great. So I'm thankful. I know that.
Go ahead, Briley.
I don't really have many questions because I got to actually meet Chris down at Seahorse World, which is just amazing.
So you did, and it was great meeting you as well.
Yes, it was. I was totally blown away by the mass production of all the seahorses. And the little handfish, they were incredible.
And I know Tina.
Look into my eye.
Yeah,
oh,
exactly.
Lord, we're not doing the eye one on this one,
yeah.
okay, guys? No
She can do it. You can get me whenever she wants, but I know she's starting up a seahorse tank, so.
I am. We are halfway ready there.
Tina, I wanted to ask, are you on Facebook? Did we get this settled last week? Are you part of Seahorse Sources group and Seahorse Keeping
Yes,
Day
I
Fun?
am.
Okay.
I am now, yeah.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure that's, my group and Dan's group, and they're good groups. There's also Seahorses and Pipefish, Seahorses Australia. I just wanted to basically give a shout out to all of the people working really hard to provide good information in these groups.
Chris, is there anybody else in Australia commercially breeding now that the other two places closed down?
No, so we were the very first seahorse farm to set up, and historically I think there's been 3 others over the years, but we are currently still the only one running.
Do they allow you to collect breeders?
That's what I was getting ready to ask. Great question.
Great question. So I do actually have a permit to collect some. I'm finding it very, very difficult to get reliable information on where to find them. I do know where there are some in another state, but the exact location of where they are, which I do know, is a place that we can't actually collect from because it's a little sanctuary that's protected. And so I need to find a place where I can find them and collect them legally, and track them down. And the problem is, if you, like many of you guys who actually had the luck of being able to go diving and actually find seahorses in the wild, would probably know and relate to this really well. Seahorses, especially when they're smaller species, the smaller they are, the harder they are to find. They blend in incredibly well in their environment. And so if you're going around swimming looking for a little seahorse, it's like this big, it's like looking for a needle in a haystack.
Yep. Yeah, for the dwarf seahorses, they don't even dive for them. They use nets and trawls.
It's interesting to me that, obviously these regulations and rules are in place, and the marine protected areas are extremely important. They're making a big difference in certain countries, but you can't progress in the farming if you can't get the brood stock. So it just confuses me.
No, it's actually a really good point. And, it's one of those things that I do have the permit, but my permit is specifically only for Tasmania. And so my problem is I don't know where the breviceps are in Tasmania. I know where they are in Victoria, but I don't have a permit for Victoria, if that makes sense. Getting the permit in a different state that you're not in is very difficult, and it's actually quite costly if Seahorse World wanted to fund a trip for me to go over and collect some in Victoria. Because we're just a small, private commercial business, it would be a big leap of faith for them to, fund a little expedition for me to go over to Victoria with the intent to collect some. And it's a bit of a kind of a lot of paperwork involved in getting permits and everything to make that happen.
If you did come back empty-handed, that would really suck. And I think
definitely.
I think I did misunderstand. So just to correct myself, and so that I understand better, it's not about protected areas. It's just about the way Australia works is the license. Well, the way everywhere works, the license is per the area. So you can't go out of your area. I get it now. I'm sorry that I misunderstood. So
I'm not sure, based on Victoria's laws, whether I'd be able to get the permit to actually go into those areas. They could actually just say you can have the permit to collect the breviceps, but you can't have the permit to go into these protected areas because they're protected regardless. They can basically impose whatever condition they want. And so, we have had situations in the past where we've wanted to collect a certain species from a certain area, and you still get told no. Just because we apply for it doesn't mean we actually get the permission. But yeah, we try and do everything in a sustainable way, and that's kind of all we want, just to be able to collect broodstock to keep perpetuating these different species of seahorses. And right now in Australia, basically all cygnathids, all pipefish, all sea dragons, and all seahorses are all very heavily protected. Currently, Western Australia, or WA, is the only, I'll say it's the easiest state to be able to collect from. They're a bit more sort of lenient with their collection permits, and so you do have a lot of collectors collecting from the wild over there. And they're probably the easiest state in Australia to collect from at the moment.
Normal people can collect from the wild in certain areas. Is that what you said?
Only if you have the right collection permits.
Okay, so everyone in Australia has to have a permit. We're going to have Sam on next week, and she's going to discuss. Hopefully, Briley will come back and we'll get the audio working. We'll practice through the week, and we're going to have Briley and Sam talk about being a hobbyist in Australia. And then just a preview for anybody viewing, the week after that, I'm going to have a hobbyist breeder talk about breeding on the hobbyist level. So you'll see ads for it, but I just wanted to mention it. The more that I looked into Seahorse World, the more I was impressed. You are doing an amazing job. So I personally thank you for everything you're doing, and continue, please. More
Thanks.
Questions? Dan, did you have any more questions? Or
No, not really. I understand what he's going through with the permitting process. In Florida, there's different types of permits. And there's also what's called no-take areas, and it doesn't matter what kind of permit you have, the no-take area is a no-take. In Florida, you have a recreational permit, then you have a collector's permit, and then there's the scientific permit, which gives a tremendous amount of leeway for doing research. But even with a scientific permit, they can't go in the no-take zones. They're
Protected.
Those are just protected areas, you know. And I understand that, and I get that, and you know, it's how it is. I mean, we had a local area it was interesting that in this particular local area there was a lot of seahorses, and people found out about it, and it was a famous dive spot. And once people found out there were seahorses there, all of a sudden everybody was trying to dive and collect all the seahorses, and they had to make it a no-take zone because it was, you know, it was more of a tourist area where people could go in and look at things and see things.
Yeah, of course.
Instead of people going in and just wiping it out, you know.
I was reading an article about the fact that these marine protected areas have all these issues too. For instance, predators. You know, you can protect the area from humans, but then when, you know, fish aren't as stupid as people think, and when the predators figure out that the seahorses are hanging in this area, that's where they're going to go to eat. And there's just all these reasons why they have problems too. So my question is to both of you guys or anyone, do you think that the protected areas are making a difference in conservation?
I might take this one for Australia. I think that Australia, in many ways, is kind of leading the charge with protected sanctuaries and whatnot. I know from growing up in Australia, I know of quite a few marine sanctuaries and no-take zones, things of that sort of nature. But I think it's very important that Australia does sort of lead the charge in that sort of respect, because I'm not quite sure of the exact statistic off the top of my head, but I know that we have almost half of the species of seahorses found in the world just in Australia.
Right.
And they're very endemic and not found anywhere else in the world. And, you know, that doesn't just apply to seahorses. You know, all of the seadragons are just found here in Australia. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, it's a massive biodiversity hotspot. And so it's very sort of crucial and critical that we do protect a lot of those areas so that we have seahorses, and not just seahorses, sea dragons and cygnathids in general, just, you know, fish and wildlife for the future. I think it's highly critical that we don't just think of, you know, today or, you know, 1 year from now or 10 years from now, 20 years from now. I think it's important that we have, you know, these areas untouched and protected for the generations to come.
Just interesting to hear the different sides of things, because I do agree with everything you just said, and it is very important to think of the future. But in a sense, you are also thinking of the future. So not allowing you to collect broodstock, which would promote more captive bred specimens in the hobby, maybe someday traditional Chinese medicine, you know what I mean? So I just wonder if maybe the protected areas aren't a great thing, but maybe they should allow certain people certain things. But I could be wrong. Dan, go ahead.
Well, you have to remember that most rules and laws are made for the masses, not for the individuals. And each rule and law has sometimes some unintended consequences. Mm-hmm. Sometimes there's ways to go around those things. But I can tell you from experience in living in Florida as a child, you know, where we used to go and hang out to work on the boat, there was nobody there. You know, today on a Memorial Day weekend, there might be 3,000 boats anchored in that spot, and the population of Florida has expanded so much, and there's just so many people that you have to protect some things. And I don't always agree with how they go about making the determination, but there is some logic and some reason behind it. You know, the big sore spot for most boaters in Florida is the manatees. You know, they have all these quote unquote manatee zones where boats are supposed to go at an idle, but they got these signs up that, you know, from this point to this point, you have to idle. And I'm just not sure that the manatees know what the signs say and where to hang out. But, you know, they've got these signs up that, you know, but as far as the no-take zones, it makes sense to me in some of these spots where they've done it. Areas where we used to fish, now there are no-take zones. now a tourist spot for people to dive and look and see, but don't touch anything. If they allowed people to take, there'd be nothing left. It's just, there's just too many people going in to do things.
You're right. I don't disagree. I want to see more seahorses in the captive breeding thing, but it is way more important to keep the seahorses in the wild protected. So I do agree with both of you. Thank you for, making your points, because they're both very, very good. What are your favorite species and fish that you can only find in Australia that you get to see that we don't get to see often?
That's a really, really tough question.
I know, I'm sorry.
Probably, I'll
really good with the tough questions, Chris. I'm not kidding.
Something that I was getting right into right before I came to Seahorse World was shrimp, freshwater shrimp, all different kinds of shrimp. I'm a bit of a shrimp nerd, and so I have this like mini obsession happening with different types of shrimp, crayfish, and crustaceans and invertebrates. And so I absolutely love all different kinds of shrimp, whether they're freshwater, saltwater, all different kinds of crayfish, lobsters, whatever. And so things like even just simple mysid shrimp and whatever, they're really interesting to me. We do actually have a very special display at Seahorse World, which is a giant freshwater crayfish. And they are the largest freshwater crustacean or invertebrate in the world. And they're only found exclusively down here in Tasmania. And if you look on a map, Tasmania is a very, very small in comparison to the rest of Australia. And these giant freshwater crayfish are only found in about 14% of Tasmania. So they're only found in this tiny, tiny little zone up in northern Tasmania in waterways that flow into the Bass Strait. And so I would probably say that they're my personal favourite. We have only one giant freshwater crayfish. Her name is Asta. And, one of the big roles of my job is actually looking after her. She's been with us only a smidge longer than I've been there. And so I've made it one of my big duties to make sure that we keep her long term. And I would absolutely love one day to instigate a breeding program at Seahorse World for the giant freshwater crayfish. I would love to know what species you guys have readily available to you that are from Australia, because one of the things that I would really love is to increase that amount, so increase the amount of species that you guys have over there. And I feel like that's one of the important things that I can do for the hobby from my position.
Chris, I deal with a couple of wholesalers that buy from you guys. The potbellies obviously are available. The Barbary, the Tanneropterus or Cuda, and that's pretty much what we see coming from you guys. If you guys were breeding the reed-eye and had them in numbers that you could export them, those would be very easy to market, not just in the U.S., but elsewhere where you guys ship. What I find interesting is for the amount of abdominalis that you guys breed, we don't see that many in the United States. What we see the most of is the Cuda, and to a lesser extent the Barbary here in the U.S. And that's, every now and then somebody will get one of the other species that you mentioned, and it almost seems like somebody special ordered them. It's not like they're coming in to the wholesalers. The white eye, the Angustus, etc. Those you don't normally see in the United States, except in public aquariums. The U.S. market is primarily tropical species orientated. It's very difficult to move many cold water species. People just aren't willing to spend the chillers and set up the tanks for that. They're just not used to it. So as a consequence, I suspect, from the if I mention the names, you'd know them, but the wholesalers that I know are interested primarily in the tropical species.
With my thinking, if people are willing to get chillers and stuff for their axolotls and stuff like that are in the freshwater hobby, why wouldn't they be willing to? I mean, if I were to, that'd be the first thing I would get, would be a chiller, if that's what I was told I needed to have.
Tina, most hobbyists are not like you. And there's a lot of, and that was a compliment, by the way. That was a compliment. No, that was a compliment. Or me. I should have said, most hobbyists are not like you and I. And most hobbyists don't take that time to do the research, find out what they need, and etc. And I didn't mean to interrupt you, Dan, but that's my personal opinion as a hobbyist. I see it all around me, and I'm not perfect, and I make so many mistakes, but, you know, we're all trying to work in this together and learn and get better and do better things, and a lot of people just don't care. If there was any way we can convince the stores and the wholesalers and the people selling the seahorses to advise this to customers, like,
Yep.
if we could bring in the
And
pot
to
bellies.
stock them as well. They would need to stock the chillers as well.
Yeah.
There was a company based on the West Coast that specialized in cold water species of fish, and that's all they sold. They collected cold water species. They brought in cold water species, and I'm not talking about just seahorses. I mean fish in general. And they eventually went under. They could not support themselves in the U.S. market. And
Wow.
for whatever reason, you know, in the United States, people are just really, really, really cheap when it comes to the hobby and what they're willing. They'll spend a fortune on some things, but other things they
Right.
won't. They just won't even begin to spend a dime on.
And the thing I have noticed is the ones that are really, really dedicated to the hobby spend the money that needs to be done. But even we will go for the better deal. Like I'm the first one to admit, on my 20-gallon tank, my skimmer, I paid $80. I could have went $300 and got a skimmer that's roughly a little bigger, but that skimmer will do. I just made sure I looked around, is this thing going to work, before I bought it, and was ready to drop the money for the more expensive skimmer if that were the case. It's you have to educate yourself on what you're getting first, whether that is equipment or it's the livestock, and especially the livestock, you know.
Quick question for Chris. Down under, are you seeing hobbyists that readily get chillers for their hobby?
Yeah, so I'll sort of kind of echo what you guys said before. You know, anyone in the aquarium hobby loves to cut corners and cut costs where they can. And so that's something that I readily find here. Someone comes to us, they say, hey, I want to keep seahorses. And one of the very first things that I say is, where do you live? So I try and get a feel for their climate. And then I readily advise from there. So even with the pot bellies, we sell the most of them, but I'll only advise people to actually keep them probably if they live in Victoria or South Australia, maybe, possibly if they're not up in Adelaide, or Tasmania. If they live up in, say, Queensland or somewhere that's really, really warm, I'll probably just recommend it's either subtropical or tropical. I feel like they'll have more success with that. So I want people to have success when they actually get a seahorse from us. Mm-hmm. And so if I feel like, you know, us giving them a temperate species means well, they might just go, oh, I can't keep seahorses, and so, you know, I give up. But that's not what I want. I want people to actually succeed and thrive with their aquariums. And so I try and just sort of nip it in the bud there and actually advise them based on where they live. But even just the basics, like making sure your tank is fully cycled and ready to go. So unfortunately, it's not one of those things you can necessarily rush. And so quite often we're actually sort of waiting on our customers a little bit. You know, we have the seahorses ready to go and we could have shipped them weeks ago, but we're waiting for the hobbyists to be ready for them. And that's something we try and promote as well.
I think that's awesome. So you will actually hold them for an order. So that, wow, see, wow, that's really cool. That's very impressive. You know, I just want to bring people together from all across the world to work on getting better with seahorses. So, did anyone else have any questions for Chris or anyone else in the conversation before I go ahead and cut this, because I don't want it to be 500 hours long? All right, well then, thank you if you tuned in, or if you're watching later. Next week we'll have a new guest on, and you can always ask questions afterwards, and I will get them to the previous guests. We're going to be starting some new things, so stay tuned. Keep coming. Thank you so much, Chris, from Seahorse World, for coming on and talking about Seahorse World with us and seahorses. Excellent interview, excellent information. Everybody have a fantastic night,